Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event on the role of the Green Climate Fund in scaling up finance for climate action. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, a special welcome and a quick word about where you're tuning into. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Wilson. We were mandated by Congress to connect policy, practice, and research through nonpartisan, independent analysis and open dialogue. Our program's expertise span every region of the world and today's most pressing issues. We have 7 programs co-sponsoring this event, which really speaks to the importance of the topic for every corner of the globe. I'd like to thank my colleagues in our Asia program, Africa program, Global Europe program, Mexico Institute, Latin America program, and Brazil Institute for their support of today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, connects issues at the intersection of environment, health, and security to foreign policy and development. For over a decade, we've explored how climate change undermines human security and the need for climate mitigation and adaptation that simultaneously supports the broader resilience of communities most at risk. As you'll hear from our speakers today, climate's most immediate impacts are being felt in parts of the world least ready to respond, and there is a critical need to scale up finance for climate action. How we deploy that financing, how we assist countries and communities to build their capacity to cope with climate change, how we partner with them to support economic growth that is aligned with global climate goals will ultimately determine our success in curbing the climate crisis. Today, we are delighted to host the Green Climate Fund's Glemerick and a panel of leading thinkers and doers on this important issue. Before I turn the event over to Ambassador Green for opening remarks, I'd like to offer my gratitude to our speakers and panelists for their contribution to today's discussion. I'd also like to thank my colleagues behind the scenes, including ECSP's Amanda King and Ratia Tekanet, and our audiovisual team for making it possible for us to host these important discussions. And now it's my privilege to introduce the Wilson Center's president and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, for welcoming remarks. Mark joined the Wilson Center from the McCain Institute, where he was executive director. As a former administrator of USAID, ambassador to Tanzania, and member of Congress, Mark has a well-rounded and grounded understanding of the key role that foreign assistance plays in increasing the capacity of developing countries to manage risks like climate change. Ambassador Green, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Lauren, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center, where we tackle global issues through independent research, honest dialogue, and actionable ideas. Building on what Lauren just said, there are few topics that more qualify as global issues than what brings us here today. I think it's finally sinking in for Americans, not only that our climate is changing, but what that could mean in very practical terms. That it could affect where and how we grow food, the availability of employment, the habitability of coastal communities, small island states, and drought-stricken lands. That it's creating the conditions for extreme weather events and risking lost lives, devastated livelihoods, and new patterns of migration for humans and animals alike. For communities in the developing world, climate is hindering the ability of already overstretched governments to meet the needs of their people, to provide basic and essential services. A recent study of 19 countries found that rising global temperatures could contribute to child malnutrition as much, or in some cases more, than poverty, inadequate sanitation, and poor education. In the Sahel, increasing resource scarcity is fueling record levels of displacement and increasing conflict over access to usable land. The good news is that there's an opportunity in how we respond to climate change to build greater food and water security, to build new paths to employment, and to provide clean power to the nearly 1 billion people without electricity today. It won't be easy. It will require a multi-sectoral, multinational approach that harnesses the power of innovation, markets, and private enterprise, while tapping into the convening and coordinating power that only the public sector can bring. It will require mobilizing the financial and technical resources necessary to build capacity and enable all nations to embrace the paradigm shift behind the smartest climate mitigation and adaptation interventions. How these financial and technical resources are managed, how they are channeled to the communities that need them most, and how they are applied to climate responses will ultimately determine the viability of these investments. Now, some Americans may wonder why all of this requires American dollars invested in other countries. And I suppose that's the age-old question that we development hands face. Beyond the moral question of helping others in need, a case I happen to subscribe to be clear, this is in our self-interest. The evidence is clear. If developing nations can't access greener technologies in infrastructure and energy, then they will inevitably embrace the same technologies that we did for decades. In many ways, cheaper and easier, but in every way, more damaging to our resources, land, air, and water. If they do make those choices in their efforts to develop economically, then quite frankly, all of the changes that we make here in the US and Europe, well, quite frankly, will fall short of what the world needs. And that's what brings us to today's topic, the Green Climate Fund. The GCF has been hailed by the Biden administration as an indispensable player in supporting developing countries to finance climate action. It was established within the framework of the UNFCCC to help position leaders to build the unprecedented coalitions that we'll all need to meet the challenges of our changing climate, both the causes and the consequences. Today, the Wilson Center is delighted to host Glemerick, Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, as well as this high-level panel of leaders. These leaders will explore how institutional support, innovative financing solutions, and new partnerships can mobilize and apply the investment needed to scale up climate action and to build the capacity of developing countries across the globe. This is a timely and very important discussion. And again, we're delighted to be hosting it. Lauren, back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Green, for helping to set the stage and for setting out the purpose of today's discussion. In particular, I would underline your point about not just the critical need to scale up the climate finance, but also the need to develop new kinds of partnerships and approaches that can get us across the goal line. And now I'm delighted to introduce Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, Glemerick, for opening remarks. Yannick is someone whose professional and academic experience represents much of what the Wilson Center aims for, that bridging of deep research and practical experience and policy development. Yannick has 30 years of international experience in climate change, development, and finance, and the intersection of these key areas. He has served as UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Program for UN Women, and has held key roles with UNDP and the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund. In addition to his practical leadership on complex international development and environment issues, Yannick has a PhD from the University of Paris and 2 master's degrees, and is widely published in the field of risk management, renewable energy, climate finance, and the co-benefits between human rights, gender equality, and climate action. Yannick, it's a real pleasure to host you at the Wilson Center. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good morning, everybody in Washington, and good evening from South Korea, where the Green Climate Fund is headquartered. Thank you, Ambassador Mark Green, for your inspiring opening remarks, and Lauren, for your kind introduction. I would like to express my sincere thanks also to the Wilson Center for hosting the Green Climate Fund here today to discuss our role in scaling up finance for climate action. You have summed it up extremely well, Ambassador Green. The climate crisis is here, and so is the opportunity to respond. Over 120 countries responsible for about 60% of emissions have adopted or are considering net zero targets. These net zero targets have put the Paris Agreement's goal within striking distance. 2021 is a critical year for action. President Biden's recent climate summit has helped galvanize global efforts to limit warming, mobilize private finance to drive the net zero transition, and help vulnerable countries cope with the impacts of climate change. The 2 objectives are equally important. We must both scale up climate mitigation and adaptation effort to address the climate crisis. Climate impacts are materializing faster than expected. For example, 20 years ago, we were not anticipating threat to the survival of unique ecosystems to materialize before a mean global temperature increase of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. Today, we fear that a 2 degrees Celsius increase in mean global temperature could wipe out 90% of coral reef and endanger the security and economic livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. Ambassador Green mentioned the huge cost of adaptation, expected to rise to up to $500 billion per year by 2050. Yet globally, only 1/5 of the funds mobilized for climate finance is going to adaptation and resilience, exposing millions to the worst impacts of climate change. The Green Climate Fund can play a significant role in supporting efforts to finance climate ambition, particularly for adaptation and resilience. GCF was established to promote a paradigm shift in our fight against climate change. We are the largest dedicated climate fund supporting developing countries, and the GCF accounted for 2/3 of all multilateral climate finance last year. Half of our resources are allocated to adaptation, and over 2/3 of our adaptation funding go to the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world. GCF is an open, country-driven partnership. We work with over 200 national and international partners, including commercial and development banks, civil society organizations, United Nations agencies, and private equity funds. This enables us to foster unprecedented coalition to finance frontier climate investment. Notably, we work closely with the private sector by using a range of financing instruments to meet the needs of developing countries and investors, be grant, concessional debts, guarantees, or equity. This flexibility let us pilot new financial structure to create new markets for new climate solutions. GCF investment of 8.4 billion are leveraging almost 22 billion in additional public and private finance. GCF has also developed extensive environmental and social safeguards to promote inclusive and responsive climate finance. We leverage these capabilities in 4 ways. First, we work with developing countries to help create an enabling policy environment for climate action and to raise the ambition of their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. We also work with developing countries to realize this climate ambition by translating their NDCs into investment plan. This is particularly important to ensure that their key adaptation and resilience projects are prioritized, that these projects are financed through the right sources of finance using the right instrument that meet their specific needs. St. Lucia, for example, one of the small island developing states hardest hit by climate change, has translated its NDC into a detailed investment plan. GCF will help St. Lucia explore financial innovation like resilience bonds and climate debt swaps to supplement public resources and finance this effort without raising its debt burden. Second, we pilot innovative ideas to establish a proof of concept. Innovation in new technologies, business models, and financing instruments is imperative if we are to achieve our climate goals. Technological innovation is required to accelerate efforts in sectors hard to decarbonize, such as transport and industrial processes, and innovative business models and financing instruments are critical to de-risk private investment at scale in adaptation and nature-based solutions. 2/3 of our projects support technology development and transfer to developing countries. For example, in partnership with Acumen Fund, a US impact investment fund, GCF is providing risk capital to small and medium enterprises that are developing off-grid solar and climate-resilient agriculture solutions for vulnerable communities in East Africa. Risk capital is extremely scarce in developing countries, yet it is a precondition for innovation. Third, we strive to make blended finance work better for adaptation, low-income countries, and small island developing states. Blended finance has proven effective for mature technologies in mature markets, but not for early-stage technologies in early-stage markets. In 2012-2018, $205 billion was mobilized from the private sector by official development finance intervention, but only 5.3% of these flows went to LDCs and other low-income countries, and very little to adaptation and nature-based solutions. Together with our partners, particularly the private sector and development banks, we crowd in private finance by serving as an early investor to establish a commercial track record for new climate solutions. One exciting initiative with a US private equity firm, Pegasus Capital, is the Global Subnational Climate Fund. This initiative leveraged $150 million in GCF equity investment to mobilize $600 million in institutional finance for climate mitigation and adaptation projects at the critical subnational level. Half of the countries participating in this program are least developed countries and small island developing states. With our partners, we are also working on several new private equity initiatives to specifically de-risk private investment in adaptation technologies and coral reef protection. Examples of potential investment include sustainable seaweed-based fertilizers or nutritional supplement made from kelp forest and water recycling technologies. Finally, we strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions and entrepreneurs to accelerate the widespread adoption of commercially attractive climate innovation. National and sub-regional development banks alone represent about 10% of global investment, disbursing more than $2 trillion annually. They are the largest group of GCF partners, and we work with them to reduce the risk of innovative climate investment. For example, we help the development banks of Southern Africa establish a dedicated climate facility, and we will assist it to issue the first municipal bonds for recycled water in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate crisis demands collective global action at unprecedented scales. Countries are taking action, but much more must be done. The Green Climate Fund stands ready to support these efforts through innovative, inclusive climate finance that can help climate action reach scale. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Yannick, for laying out the GCF's expansive role in climate finance. You set us up well for a deep dive into the issues with our expert panel. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Megan Rowling, who will be facilitating today's panel. Megan is a climate correspondent and editor with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the charitable arm of Reuters News. She specializes in humanitarian and development issues, including climate change, disasters, and resilience. We invited Megan to moderate today's discussion because of her extensive coverage of climate finance. She's someone who has been following the topic for years and brings her own important insights to the discussion. I'll turn it over to Megan now to introduce our panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed, Lauren, for the kind introduction, and to our two previous speakers for their insightful comments on this subject. As Lauren mentioned, well, my interest in climate finance has evolved, I guess, over the past decade, very much from our early coverage of the human impacts of climate change in the developing world, in the form of worsening floods, drought, heat, storms, and rising sea levels, and how those affect people's health, incomes, and mobility, especially for the poorest and the most vulnerable people. We've done many stories on adaptation and resilience efforts in Africa, Asia, and Latin America over the years. And for more than a decade now, as I mentioned, we've been trying to fill some of the gaps in media coverage on this topic. And Yannick will know from the questions I always ask him when I interview him, I'm very interested in how the Green Climate Fund can light the path towards boosting the sorely needed finance to protect people from the consequences of global warming, which are picking up rapidly, as Yannick mentioned. And he also said in his remarks that the Green Climate Fund can play a significant role in supporting efforts to finance climate ambitions, particularly for adaptation and resilience. And we know that this is actually a very tough task, because the percentage of international funding for that purpose remains stubbornly low, and people are suffering as a result. And this is especially so in conflict-hit and fragile states where insecurity and poor governance makes it hard for development agencies to get this work done. So personally, I worry that we'll end up with a kind of adaptation apartheid where stable countries attract most funding and even private investments, while others like Yemen, Central African Republic or Afghanistan struggle to get help as their natural resources degrade further and they get trapped in a kind of vicious downward spiral. Now, the Green Climate Fund has a mandate to invest equally in adaptation and mitigation, and also to shift paradigms, as well as bringing more finance to the poorest and the more vulnerable in this world. And in addition, it aims to build countries' capacity to absorb climate finance, and it's helping them work out how to pay for the measures in their national climate action plans. And so the hope has to be, I think, that the Green Climate Fund can play a key role in delivering the breakthrough on adaptation and resilience that the UN Secretary General has been calling for more strongly as time goes by. So those are some of the issues that we would like to grapple with on our panel today. But first, I'm going to introduce our four speakers in alphabetical order. We have Leo Martinez Diaz. He's a senior advisor for climate at the US Department of State. And previously, he was the global director of the Sustainable Finance Center at the World Resources Institute. And during the Obama administration, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment in the US Department of the Treasury. We have also with us Jennifer Morris, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Nature Conservancy, which has a mission of creating a world where people and nature thrive together. Previously, she was president at Conservation International, where, among other things, she developed innovative strategies using business development as a tool to protect nature. We have another speaker from the Green Climate Fund with us today. That's Kavita Sinha. She's the Deputy Director at the Green Climate Fund's Division of Mitigation and Adaptation, where she oversees public sector programming. And before that, Kavita was Program Director for Clean Energy in Asia for the European Climate Foundation. And she's also worked as climate policy advisor to the US mission in India and managed a South Asia regional program for energy cooperation for USAID. And then last but not least, we have Michelle Sumilas. Michelle is the Assistant to the Administrator of the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning at USAID. And most recently, she served as Executive Director of Bread for the World, an anti-hunger Christian advocacy organization. And she has also served as USAID Chief of Staff during the Obama administration and on the House Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations. So we have a lot of experience from USAID in this event here today. So we are going to begin with myself posing some questions to our four panelists, and then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes or so of this event for question and answer. So please feel free to email your questions at any point during the discussion to this address, ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. Please indicate your name, your title and affiliation with your submitted question. And the email is also listed below on the web page where you're watching the event. So I'll just repeat that email. It's ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll try and leave about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So please do send those in. So without further ado, I will turn to our panelists. So Leo, we'll start with you. Yannick mentioned the April 22nd Climate Leaders Summit that was hosted by President Joe Biden. And I'd like to know what role you see the GCF can play in advancing the efforts that this summit sought to galvanize notably through support to raising ambitions in countries' nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and also innovative initiatives in adaptation, including those that involve the private sector.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thank you to the hosts and the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this very timely and very important meeting. The summit was in many ways aimed primarily at raising ambition. And by that, what we usually mean is to help the world move towards net zero emissions by 2050, to have a strong, clear pathway to get to 2050, including concrete actions by 2030 in this decade, which is critical, and also to ensure that we keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. That is essential. And that was the theme that permeated the summit. And I think you saw a number of important takeaways from that summit. One, of course, was the US reestablishing its credibility and leadership in the world on climate after 4 years of absence. You saw that we announced our new NDC, in which we will cut emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 on a 2005 baseline. In terms of climate finance, President Biden announced that we will seek to double our climate finance, public climate finance by 2024, based on the peak of climate finance during the Obama-Biden administration, and will triple our financing for adaptation by the same year. Also, the FY22 budget, which will be coming out in the next few weeks, will request a $1.25 billion from Congress, specifically for the Green Climate Fund. This will help us pay back the $2 billion that were still outstanding from the Obama years, and put us in a very strong position to make additional contributions to the GCF as we reestablish US engagement and leadership in the GCF. I should add, by the way, that I served as the US representative to the GCF board for 3 years, and I had the pleasure to help make those early investments in the institution. And now I think we're at a point where the US can come back and make significant additional contributions to the fund. And finally, the summit also saw some commitments from other countries. The US, after all, is only a small part in the grand scheme of things of the emissions. We need everybody to do their part. And so we saw countries like Japan, like Canada, step up with revised commitments. And also we saw the private sector come in with a clear understanding that climate change is not just a risk and a threat, it's also an opportunity. And that's why we saw banks talking about up to $4 trillion, just US banks, in terms of the investments they anticipate making in climate over the coming decade. We saw many institutions joining net zero clubs and initiatives, which suggests that the private sector is now recognizing that this is fully in their interest. And so this is where the GCF comes in. I think the most important role it can play, as Yannick alluded to, is to be a bridge between the climate ambitions that countries are laying out in their NDCs, in their discourse, and actual implementation plans, financing plans with concrete, actionable steps. And so the GCF isn't just a fund that provides investment, it's also an institution that helps articulate those plans, and then to figure out how best to finance them. In some ways, the most important part about the GCF isn't the money, although that's of course quite important. It's the process through which it engages its member states, its countries, and the way it uses its bottom-up approach and its incredible network of accredited entities, over 100 now, that can then help address specific climate problems in both mitigation and adaptation in ways that other institutions aren't as able to do. And so this is why the GCF is an important part of the overall climate finance architecture, and that's certainly how we see it in this administration.
Thanks, Leo. And how would you perceive the GCF helping the private sector to become better involved in adaptation efforts? Because this is, a particularly tough nut to crack, and one that I know Yannick is interested in making progress on. From your perspective, how can donors work well with the GCF to enable that to happen and bring the private sector in where we, might not normally expect them to show interest?
So a few ways. I think the first is by helping countries, enabling countries to manage and measure the climate risks that they face. Once you're able to help build that capacity to help governments and their agencies understand and quantify some of those risks, to be able to use models and data and various systems, that is going to then make that climate risk real, is going to then help drive initiatives on the ground and help manage and direct both public and private investment. And so if you can't see it, you can manage it. And in many countries, even in the most advanced countries, climate risk remains somewhat opaque and difficult to understand. And so in developing countries, this is really pressing. So that's the first one. A second is to help get the private sector, the local private sector in developing countries, and local government and civil society to talk to one another. A lot of businesses in developing countries, both large and medium-sized, are investing already in adaptation and resilience. They may not call it that. They call it supply chain security. They call it business continuity management. They call it operational risk. But in reality, this is part of adaptation. So they're already doing that. But if their institutions, their factories, their facilities are climate proofed, if you will, it won't matter if employees can't get to work, if their suppliers can't deliver to their facilities, if they can't get their product to the market. And so they depend crucially on the public infrastructure and the communities that are part of their business. And so that is a piece that is missing, that private sector, public sector at the local level. And that is perhaps an area where the GCF is well positioned to help. A third is technology, which Yannick mentioned. We talk often about technology and innovation in the context of mitigation, right? And the new energies and so on. But it's also quite important to do so in adaptation. And some of these technology is kind of hard technology. It's about software and new materials and new construction designs, but it's also soft technology as well. It's the way in which we structure cities, the way in which we engage different types of citizens to protect them from the impacts. And finally,
I'm not sure if we've lost Leo. I think perhaps we have. Jennifer, hopefully we can get Leo back. And in the meantime, I'll ask you a question and we can revert to Leo afterwards. Jennifer, so I think one thing that's become clearer is that forests and conservation yield adaptation benefits as well as carbon storage benefits for communities in tropical forest countries and in other parts of the world. But again, there have been difficulties in mobilizing finance at scale for some initiatives. And obviously you have a lot of experience in doing that work. And so it would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about the challenges and opportunities for raising those funds and how the Green Climate Fund could help in that respect.
Absolutely. Thanks, Megan. It's great to be here and really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to the Wilson Center for organizing what is such a critical event and discussion around the need to scale up conservation finance. Of course, when I think about conservation finance, being the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, I think about the critical role, especially in light of the COVID crisis, for nature-based solutions. And that connection between biodiversity financing and climate financing has never been more important than now. We know that the World Health Organization has said very clearly, this is not an environmental organization, this is the World Health Organization, has said the most important thing we can do to prevent the next pandemic is to protect nature. And the biodiversity financing sector is 5-6 years at least behind the climate financing sector. So as we think about the GCF and the incredible resources and the incredible programming that it has, I will make a challenge to Yannick and the team, which is to continue to invest in nature-based solutions where you get both climate benefits, clearly, and you get biodiversity and of course prevention of zoonotic diseases as well. So making sure we're using every single taxpayer dollar that's going into the GCF in the most effective way possible is critical. And part of that, as you mentioned, Megan, is of course the critical role of forest finance. And the GCF has done some fantastic stuff in this space. They provided an envelope of over $500 million or $500 million for the area of reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which basically says to countries, protect your forest, we will help you pay for that. That is absolutely essential. I would suggest that the GCF double down on that to do more of that because it's really having impacts we're seeing in many countries. There was also, as Leo mentioned, thinking about the Biden summit, another really important announcement in terms of public-private partnerships that was released then was this whole area called LEAF. So it's the lowering emissions by accelerating forest finance, much better name is LEAF, the acronym. And that program is a private-public partnership between UK, Norway, and the United States to basically work with companies like Amazon and Salesforce to launch a $1 billion fund dedicated not to technology, but to nature's technology, to protecting forests and to ensuring that the carbon stores in those forests are maintained and in the ground, and to give countries that can't afford to protect their forests on their own the opportunity to do this using a blended finance mechanism, which is something the GCF is incredibly skilled at. This kind of facility of blending capital from the private sector and public sector is absolutely the way to go. And I hope that this will be one of many movements going forward to ensure that we get as much money as possible to nature-based solutions. And clearly we know that nature-based solutions represent about 30% of the total climate solution. Often ignored, less than 8% of total public financing is going into nature-based solutions. So I would implore all of us who are engaged in this space to think about the nexus between biodiversity, climate finance, and of course the need to protect future generations from another COVID crisis by ensuring a healthy relationship between nature and people. So let's make sure that we make nature part of the solution, not a victim of climate change going forward. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Jennifer. And as you mentioned, the GCF has provided funding for results-based deforestation progress in some countries, including Brazil. And this space is just really opening up, I think, in terms of new ways to fund forest protection. And so there's a lot of opportunities there. It's not risk-free, obviously. But I was just wondering if you could give us some insights into how you think the GCF could expand its work in this area. What other mechanisms might it use, and what other nature-based solutions are really important at this time?
Absolutely. So there are many. I'll pick up on one, I think, that is often, again, sort of now emerging as a really important opportunity for both private and public financing, again, that blended model, which the GCF does so well, and that's around soil. So in the United States alone, we are losing 10 billion tons of fertile soil every year because of the way we grow our food, raise our animals, et cetera. If this soil was protected and replenished globally, it could provide nearly 10% of carbon dioxide drawdown needed to avert a climate catastrophe. Now, doing that takes time and is expensive. And you can't expect the private sector to go all in on regenerative farming, as we call it, soil farming that protects soils and carbon dioxide emissions immediately without de-risking. So the GCF, using, again, a blended finance approach, can de-risk the private capital needed for farmers to actually, in the long term, to invest in different types of farming mechanisms. So we're really excited about the opportunities there. We're seeing lots of movement in this space in the US, in Brazil, in India, and other places where we're actively involved. And again, trying to find those public institutions that are willing to de-risk the private, because it will take 5, 6, sometimes 7 years for farmers to see a profit and to invest in the technology change and land use practices change needed to preserve the soil. So that's one of many opportunities, and I think the GCF has a critical role to play there.
That's a very interesting one indeed. Yes, I guess Kavita will be able to respond on that suggestion and others that we've heard so far. But as we know, I think one of the things that the Green Climate Fund has had to grapple with ever since it really started dispersing finance from about 2015 onwards is that there are a lot of demands coming the way of the Green Climate Fund. And obviously with the pandemic, and Yannick was very quick to start talking about this, the fund has also tried to step up and play a role in helping developing countries put together their green recovery plans and help them to devise policies that will respond both to the pandemic and to the climate challenges that, as many people have said, won't wait for the pandemic to be over. And so I was wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on how the GCF has been trying to do that, albeit with limited resources, because this is just a massive challenge in many countries that are also dealing with debt problems. And could you tell us a little bit about how you're sort of trying to deal with all those challenges on multiple fronts with the resources that you have?
Thanks, Megan, and thank you again for having me on this panel today. As the speakers before me have pointed out, the challenge is massive, but the time is now. And what the COVID pandemic, as you referenced, has shown is that though this COVID pandemic itself was not a climate event, it has shown that if you don't follow the science, it can impose a humongous cost. Currently, the pandemic is imposing an unprecedented financial and economic burden on countries, and much of that burden is being faced by the developing countries who are least prepared, just like as will happen with climate impacts if we don't take action now. Many developing countries have lost nearly a decade or more of development gains during the year and a half so far. So the good news, though, is, if there has to be good news, is that the pandemic has shown that the world is capable of collaboration. Countries can come together and mobilize the large amounts of funds that are needed in situations such as this, and will be needed for also fighting the global climate crisis. And that this money that is being mobilized now also provides an opportunity for the developing countries to be at a turning point and achieve the twin objectives of economic recovery as well as the goals of Paris Agreement. We can better align the climate finance behind country priorities by helping them translate their NDCs into investment plans, as Yannick mentioned, and convert that into a pipeline of bankable projects. Improving bankability of NDC project pipeline would entail addressing policy, regulatory, and institutional barriers, as well as improving the alignment of NDCs with national and regional investment plans. As Leo mentioned, GCF has the unique ability to deploy multiple range of instruments to address the preparedness of the countries, to address policy issues, as well as program financing into projects. And analysis has shown that actions which can target rapid growth in climate solutions not only create lots of jobs, but also open up investment opportunities. A recent IFC estimate shows $23 trillion can be unlocked between now and 2030 in developing countries and emerging economies in climate solutions. So the opportunity is available, and the scale is available if we can use GCF funding in a very strategic way. And we're doing that, trying to use it strategically to crowd in private capital through a combination of instruments to reduce risk, such as policy de-risking instruments, to transfer risk, such as financial de-risking, and compensate for residual risks. And this then will enable private capital to create the paradigm shift towards low emissions, climate resilient development. As Jennifer Wright pointed out, this is something that private sector needs before they can start investing. One recent example I can state is of the GCF deploying its fund in the African Integrated Climate Risk Mitigation Program. This is for the 7 least developed countries in the Sahelian region, And this was part of the Great Green Wall, an umbrella initiative of the African countries to preserve and restore about 8,000 kilometers long and 15,000 kilometer wide corridor of ecosystem, natural ecosystem, which will sequester 250 million tons of carbon dioxide and create 10 million green jobs. So as part of that, GCF has funded $83 million in grant funds to create a network of modern climate information and early warning system. The data and analytics from this will be used for forecast-based approaches to transfer risk related to climate hazards from the smallholder farmers and pastoralists to national and international insurance industry. The co-financing comes from the International Fund for Agriculture Development, the AFDB, the African Development Bank, and the Africa Risk Capacity. So partnership is again at the core of what we do. And this de-risking then not only creates the direct beneficiaries, about 1 million smallholder farmer and 5.3 million indirect beneficiaries, but then it enables the private sector to invest in the agriculture value chain, agriculture and food value chain.
And Kavita, what in your experience at the GCF have been some of the most useful things that governments can do in recipient countries where we need the climate finance to come in order to sort of create the enabling environment that will actually assuage the concerns of private investors? And because I think at the moment a lot of countries are worried that if their fiscal position is deteriorating, this is something that investors are not keen to kind of pursue in terms of investment opportunities. And how do you sort of turn that situation around?
Thanks for that question, Megan. Private sector perceives risks in multiple different ways, especially in developing countries. There are risks associated with policy, of course, legal transparency and integrity risks. These are things that the private sector doesn't want to take on. There are also risks associated with infrastructure, right? You don't have the right roads, land ownership is an issue. That creates a challenge for the private sector to invest in. And even if you take care of all of these risks, then there are also operational risks, right? Whether you will get the money that you are owed to, whether contracts would be honored, and so on and so forth. These are risks that GCF uses its various instruments to be able to address and to be able to make sure that the structures of our funding is such that it does not create a burden on the already burdened economies. So we deploy the funds and the structure in a very creative ways to be able to mobilize that. A recent example of that would be something that we worked with. It's called the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative. And this is an initiative, again, in Africa. We're working with 6 countries in Africa, 3 of which are in fragile and vulnerable state. Countries with conflicts, including the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mali. So we don't want to create additional loan burdens on these economies, but they do need to create economic infrastructure to be able to mobilize the jobs that are needed to be able to mobilize the economy. So GCF's $280 million here is being invested in through the technical assistance to create an auctions market for renewable energy. And so it's in a transparent market, deals with the legal risks as well as the reform risks, economic reform and policy risks in the countries. So in the 6 countries, it enables that shift. We're working with a lot of bilateral donor partners there, as well as the African governments there to be able to do that. Over and above that, then the risks of land, as I mentioned, and the risks of infrastructure. So public loan, we are investing together with the World Bank there in creation of these public infrastructure called the Renewable Energy Park. So the land acquisition and all the issues associated with those risks are taken care of through this public infrastructure that we are supporting create. And then balance residual risks of credit are covered through credit enhancements or viability gap funding, because if the load in the power sector does not build up as the private sector hopes for the revenue generation, so what's the viability gap? So we are using reimbursable grants there to be able to create the buffer that the private sector needs in the initial years through a grant. If they're able to make the money back, they reimburse that money. So it's a reimbursable grant. So we're deploying multiple, we're also using credit enhancements guarantees. So together our GCF's $280 million will get about $1.3 billion of World Bank's grant and loan, as well as $3.3 billion in private sector capital. This creates 2.5 gigawatts of renewable power, creates jobs, which are 2 to 3 times that traditional jobs are created in that market, and benefits about 4 million people. So, multiple ways of attracting and unlocking capital.
Thanks, Kavita. It's really excellent to have a very detailed example of how that can work. And how the GCF can reduce a lot of these different risks and open the way for more money to come in behind it. I'd like to bring in Michelle now from USAID. As we've already mentioned today, a lot of the countries that are most exposed to climate change are also affected by conflict or high risk of conflict. And some of them have quite weak institutions and governance. And so I'd like to ask you where you see the opportunities for climate finance to be used, both in the sense of shoring up climate resilience and preventing any sort of tensions that could actually contribute to conflict, but also, and so reinforcing stability as well, where we have these difficult dynamics at play. And could you fill us in on any examples that you have where USAID has been able to partner with GCF in complex environments like this, and what kind of lessons have been learned so far? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having USAID here. And I want to just say thank you to the Wilson Center for pulling all of us together. I think one of the things that was a real theme of the Leader Summit that President Biden called last month, and is a theme of the meeting here today, is the need for all the different organizations and entities in the climate sector to play the role that they need to play in order for us to meet the goals that Leo laid out at the beginning. And I really am excited to be here. My background is in global health, and seeing in climate change now all these different entities playing different roles is so very important. So I just want to, I guess I'll just start by saying that we actually see USAID as a bridge on the other side of the spectrum, as you're laying out, Megan, for those countries who probably are not yet eligible for GCF funding for various reasons and or need more assistance before they can become eligible. And so we spend a lot of our time working in countries like that. We provide a lot of technical assistance through, not through our climate change programs necessarily, but through other governance and democracy type programs, where we strengthen the regulatory systems in countries so that they're prepared and are an enabling environment for attractive investment, either by GCF or by the private sector or by others. We also are working really closely with our colleagues in country to really strengthen their NDC plans, to make sure that those are very clear, very specific, that they have a way forward, and that they're really able to have specific programs that might be helpful. We do a lot of work also trying to bring organizations and people together. So for example, we work to get accreditation of the Pacific Community, which allowed 26 different countries and territories to together access GCF funds, where they wouldn't have been able to do that previously. And so we try to think about different ways of being creative in creating those environments. Finally, I would just also say that we do also incubate early stage finance efforts for emerging technologies and for really early stage kind of small investments that make the difference. In terms of our work in conflict settings and more fragile states, in those environments, we do a lot of work on adaptation, on disaster risk reduction, on mitigation, all those things which are helping hopefully to bring countries and communities together, working with local organizations, with indigenous communities, really trying to learn from them about what they need and what makes a difference. I think also a really good example of a country that's not necessarily a fragile state, but where we've been able to really make a difference is a country like Indonesia, where we were able to work with them to really to help them find $8 billion of their own resources that they're now putting to adaptation by good governance, by training 72 different entities in their government to try to help them both, I'm sure, get resources from the Green Climate Fund, but also their own. And finally, I would just say we spend a lot of attention focused on climate smart agriculture, as Jennifer was talking about, as well as water services, which is a major source of conflict in many of these countries, trying to figure out how can we build systems that make water more accessible, more available. We did that in the Marshall Islands, which was able to get a $25 million grant from the Green Climate Fund for the water services in this water sector. So really trying to think about those things that lead to conflict. I think we'll also all be challenged by the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will have had significant impacts on the democracy and governance sectors. We've seen a lot of backsliding, and so we'll be working a lot on that sector, which is very complementary to the work that we're talking about here. But I also just want to do a shout out to my USAID colleagues who've moved on. Ambassador Green was such a strong leader, and we're really pleased that he's in the Wilson Center now leading on these issues, as well as Kavita, who worked very closely with us in India. It's really fun to see colleagues who've moved on and still all of us can work together. So thanks for the question.
Yes, and it's clear that USAID is doing a lot of important work in helping countries kind of get to the position where they can access climate finance. And I think one of the things that's become clear over the last few years is that there's a growing integration between development work and, in some cases, humanitarian work and climate adaptation and also emissions reductions efforts, and that there's going to be more of that in the future. At the same time that the development aid and climate finance have kind of occupied separate spaces. And so I was just interested in your thoughts, Michelle, on how you see that changing in the coming decade and what this greater integration between development and climate adaptation aims means for climate finance and how we measure it and deploy it as well from the USAID perspective.
Thank you for the question. This is actually going to be a major theme. We announced at the Climate Summit last month that we'll be drafting a new climate strategy, which we will release at COP26. I think this is a major theme for us, which is really understanding how climate change needs to be integrated into our existing programs and can't be a standalone project over there away from everything. I think Jennifer did a really nice job of really connecting the biodiversity and climate change work. That has been going on for a long time at USAID, but we now increasingly are connecting our climate change work with our agriculture work, with our water work, and as you said, our humanitarian work on disaster risk reduction, and also encouraging those programs to really think outside of what has been their traditional box of just providing resources and grant funding, but also then having them in our humanitarian bureau work with folks in our bureau that works on food security and water programs. I just give a hat tip to Ambassador Green, who really worked on a reorganization of USAID, which everybody rolls their eyes at reorganization and says, does that really make a difference? But he made very clear connections between our agriculture work, our water work, our humanitarian work, our climate change work, and that we're going to build on those connections that he made in this new administration. So I would just say, we put a new climate advisor into our agriculture and water programs, which is a new innovation here, and we'll continue to do such things. But I think increasingly we're going to see that development cannot be separate from climate change. It all needs to be done together, and we're going to try to be a leader on that in the environment, in the space.
That is excellent to hear. Thank you very much indeed, Michelle. Now, I must just say to everybody that unfortunately Jennifer Morris from TNC has to sign off very shortly as she has another engagement. Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to add anything after what you've heard from the other speakers briefly before you have to leave us.
Yes, apologies. I would just add that the work of the Green Climate Fund is so important, and the time is now that we really scale up. We look for opportunities to streamline how proposals go through, how folks get accredited, ensuring that we can deploy as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, with all of the right safeguards, of course, being considered, because we don't have time to waste. The urgency now, given COVID, the climate crisis, for which of course there is no antidote, as well as the biodiversity crisis, all together now, we've got to help countries, especially those countries that USAID works with, and that they really are going to suffer and have, as someone mentioned, are really seeing a decrease in their development objectives as a result of all the things that are happening with COVID. So we've got to invest now. And the Nature Conservancy wants to have these partnerships with all of you, and we are developing some really innovative financial tools with the private sector. Please look to us as your colleague, as your partner in the fight ahead. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much indeed, Jennifer. Goodbye for now, and thanks for your contributions. I remember that, Leo, we didn't quite get to the end of what you were saying because we got interrupted by the internet playing up. And I just wanted to come back to you before we go to the Q&A session. Please don't forget to submit your questions to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. Leo, you were talking about the different ways that the private sector can help bring in more money for adaptation. I think you were talking about the potential role of technology and support for technology in the soft sense, and then we lost you. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to finish what you were saying, and if there was anything in particular you wanted to pick up on from our other panelists, please go ahead.
Yes, I would add one more thing, which is in the mitigation space, we often talk about the importance of policy and how different types of policies, from carbon pricing to feed-in tariffs for solar energy and so on, can help then shape the incentives and the cost-benefit calculations of the private sector, thereby opening the gates to lots of capital. Well, in adaptation, something similar could happen as well, even though we don't talk about it as much. If we see stronger policies that enable better, more resilient infrastructure, if we have stronger building codes and better zoning regulations and a more effective climate risk disclosure guidelines, then I think we will be providing the private sector with very significant incentives to move. It's not just about mobilizing private capital with public money like the GCFs. That, of course, is useful, but it's expensive and it cannot be done at truly large scale. And so the role of policy really has to be underlined here. And that is an area where I think all of us collectively can help.
Thanks very much indeed, Leo. So we're going to move on now to our questions, and we have received some very good questions. So I think a few of them are definitely directed at GCF. Kavita, I have to put you in the spotlight, but as the event is about GCF and its role, I guess that's not too surprising. So I'm just going to read out some of the questions that I have here. Maybe I'll do a couple for GCF and then we'll come back to that if there are more for GCF. So the first question I have here comes from Sarah Schonhardt, who's a reporter at E&E News. And she says, critics say that the process of unlocking GCF funds is cumbersome and can take too much time when finance is desperately needed as soon as possible to limit global warming. How can the fund be reformed to ensure money gets where it's needed quickly? That's one question. And the second question, which is also for GCF, coming from Kristen Patterson, Director of Drawdown Lift. Will the Green Climate Fund's innovative financing for climate adaptation include funding for reproductive health and voluntary family planning as part of climate adaptation projects that build resilience? That's an interesting one. I don't think I've seen any projects around that theme so far. Over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Really interesting questions. On the question of efficiency and effectiveness of GCF's programming and funding, GCF's been really working on that for some time, and our programming efficiency is improving. That's not yet the most optimal. We need to improve. The need for speed is really hard felt. And we're working towards improving, not just approving the funds, but also making sure that the funds get out in the field as soon as possible. And our track record on that is improving significantly. Currently, 70% of our funds are actually being, the efficiency of deploying them faster is getting there. Some of the reforms that we've been talking about also includes a new channel of funding, such as the Simplified Access Programming Channel, the SAP, which is for small programs, $10 million and below, which is a more simplified process and can go through much faster. We are looking at some of these policies that, of course, need board approval, and hopefully we will have some of these passed through the coming board processes and will improve our efficiencies in the coming years as well, in the coming months as well. Some of the questions on the reproductive health, that's interesting. As everybody knows, we actually program funds which are country driven and country priority driven. These are aligned with the country's NDCs and others. And so we basically depend on those projects which are driven by the countries and their priorities. In the health sector so far, much of the funding that we are, the programming that we have seen are mostly related to the vulnerability, reducing the vulnerability of the people to climate hazards. And also we're looking at some programming on the vaccine health chain for now. So ensuring that the vaccines can be rolled out, looking at cold chains and so on and so forth, if we can finance those. Who knows what the future will entail with USAID support and others. If there are new programming opportunity this comes along, GCF will, of course, look at them and program them based on our investment criteria and our board policies.
Yes, I do think that area has been more traditionally seen as something on the development side of work, but like you say, who knows for the future. So the third question I have here, a very interesting and challenging one from Erica Claseri, Bureau Environmental Officer and Climate Integration Lead at the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. Basically asking, how does the expert panel see the role of environmental justice in core climate financing? And what are some of the examples of best practice on adopting climate and environmental justice, not just as an ideology, but also as an integrated practice? I think we'll start with Leo on that one. I mean, this has been very interesting to hear from the Biden administration, how strongly the president wants to put environmental justice at the core of domestic action, climate action in the US. So I'm wondering how that can be better, or how it might be reflected in foreign policy as well, and in overseas climate finance.
A couple of ways. One is, as is very clear from what's going on at the GCF, the need to target countries that are already highly vulnerable and least able to cope with the impacts of climate change. And that's why the GCF, by its own policies, already targets at a minimum 25% of its commitments to least developed countries, African states, and small island developing states. That's a floor, not a ceiling. And so far, the GCF has been able to deliver quite well on that. It's also something that we target directly through our bilateral assistance as well. So you got to target those countries that are in the front lines of the impacts. Then you need to look inside countries, as we are across the world, including the United States, and thinking about those communities that have been, for historical reasons, for reasons of marginalization and structural discrimination and so on, left at higher vulnerability than others. And to figure out how do we address those directly, not just as palliatives, but also the root causes. And in many cases, we realize that climate vulnerability is just an extension of socioeconomic vulnerability and marginalization. And so that's a way to do it, is you need to look not just across countries, you need to look inside countries and really ask what can be done. And lastly, that's the importance of community-based solutions, especially in resilience and adaptation. The challenges are local. They have to also come from the local thinking and the local political economy. And so that's also an area where the GCF excels.
Thanks, Leo. And Michelle, I'll take that question to you now. Obviously, as the question was coming from a colleague as well. How do you see this playing out in the policy developments that we'll see at USAID and the new strategy? Is this something that you're thinking about right now?
So I think this will play out in a couple of different ways, and I really appreciate the question from my colleague. First, I think, as Leo said, this is an important issue and something that we focus on a lot. And we are working currently, as you might know, there was an executive order from President Biden early in the administration about how we would address racial equity in our programming across the U.S. government. And so there's two efforts going on. One is really looking at who we work with on the ground, who our partners are, and how we address their needs and their efforts. And so just at the end of the last administration, and we reaffirmed the Indigenous Peoples Policy, which really encourages all of our programs to work very closely with local entities, organizations, and folks who often are not part of these kinds of conversations and have been marginalized in their own countries. So we're working on that. We're working as a result of that with a lot of women's organizations and communities that are not necessarily sitting at the government tables. The other application of this is really looking at how USAID shows up at the table and how we program our resources, how we develop plans, how we work on these issues. And so as we develop our strategy, which we'll release at COP, as I said, we'll be applying a racial equity lens to how our programming works, who we collaborate with, what do the NDC plans say, who's being asked to make choices that may be difficult, and how do we make sure that our programming provides incentives to continue to work with new and different communities. So this will continue to be a priority for us. We look forward to incorporating this into all of our work across all of our programming.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that shows up in the new strategy and then how that shapes work going forward. Thank you for that, Michelle. I have another question for Kavita now, specifically on the Green Climate Fund. The question is from Susan Bass, the Senior Vice President of earthday.org. Susan says climate literacy is critical to building the green economy, green tech and green consumers, as well as public support for bold action on climate change. And her question is, how is the GCF helping to advance? Well, she uses the phrase mandatory climate literacy. I'm not quite sure if I understand that entirely, but obviously this is key for gaining support for projects on a large scale, such as the GCF undertakes. How do you sort of communicate this and the importance of your work to the broader public in the countries where you are deploying finance?
Well, thanks for that question. Leo, as one of our former board members, can probably add to this as well, because GCF works not just alone as an entity, but through its partnerships. So we have 200 oil partners who are our accredited entities, as well as the executing entities and other implementation partners on the ground. Each one of them is an ambassador of the program on climate literacy, as you will, in communicating the challenges and the needs and building the capacity. In many of our programs, there is a capacity and outreach element built into the programs itself, which, for example, I mentioned the Sahelian program, which has a component there, which actually is educating the people, about 1.5 million people in that in those countries, educating them on the use of vulnerability, the use of data, on predictive analytics for able to make decisions which are wiser and take climate into consideration. Over and above the programmatic aspects, GCF engages in outreach efforts, and GCF's Division of External Affairs does that through multiple forums and others to engage through the media, as well as with other entities and organizations such as Wilson Center and others who have quite a lot of influence in educating. Whether there should be a mandatory climate literacy program. I'll leave it to Michelle and the other development organizations to be able to do that. I won't say that it's a preposterous. It is actually needed. Countries such as Singapore, where I've been living for the past decade and so, they have actually begun to do that as part of the primary school education, and others. Singapore, as you know, and many other island countries are seeing intrusion from the sea much more rapidly than they had anticipated. So it's become actually part of the survival and education. So development organizations and others cannot, not look at this as part of the education. Somebody mentioned the World Health Organization. So climate's sort of beginning to seep into some of these other aspects of the work that other organizations are doing.
Thanks very much, Kavita. And I will bring in Leo on this and just add another dimension to the question, which is obviously that, the GCF or State Department is looking to expand resources that it channels to the GCF, as John Kerry and today yourself has indicated. And, maybe there is also some literacy work to be done around what the GCF does and climate finance overseas in the United States more broadly, especially given that, it was absent, not entirely, but in many ways during the previous administration. And so I was just wondering about your thoughts on that and what the Biden administration plans to do in terms of boosting the reputation of climate finance among the Americans.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I think it's worth noting that folks haven't engaged Congress and other policymakers on climate finance for 4 years, and so there's a real need to talk about it once again. I think there's a real advantage here in terms of the Green Climate Fund. Back when we were engaging Congress in 2014-15 on the Green Climate Fund, the GCF was at that point still an abstraction. It was something on paper. It was little understood. It was obscure. It was hard to explain in concrete terms because it didn't exist yet. Now, 5 years later, there is a portfolio. There's projects in almost 100 countries. There's communities that are already actively benefiting across the world in sectors that people care about in very real ways with partners, right? So it's now a going concern, and it is much easier to paint a very compelling picture of what the GCF is about, what it's doing, who it's helping, and who it's serving. And I think that is really going to help. I think the GCF itself has done a good job of explaining, what it does through its website and other products. And I think very importantly, many of the partners of GCF, including our bilateral agencies, including AID and DFC, can also talk about how working with the GCF can be also strengthening of our own programming.
Thanks, Leo. Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that and how USAID might communicate around its work with GCF, both domestically and in the countries where the funding is being deployed? Thank you.
Sure. No, I'm happy to engage in that question. I think we are very focused here at USAID at really telling our story and telling the story of all of our implementers and our partners. And so Administrator Power will be doing that. We do events around the country when invited to share the work that we're doing, and we'll be sure to do that. I just also want to say that I have been so proud of my USAID colleagues since I've arrived, because although people were not publicly talking about the collaboration with GCF and with the work we were doing on climate change, it was still happening very much under the radar screen. So some of the projects that I talked about where we were able to help support countries to be able to then secure resources from the GCF, that hasn't just happened in the last 3 months. That is the result of years of work. And so I just want to call out my colleagues who worked really hard during the previous administration to continue the collaboration, even if they couldn't talk about it. And so we look forward to, being at the top of the treetop, telling the story of the GCF and of our partners and of our interagency partners. The DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, is not here on this panel, but Leo and I work with them probably on a daily basis, depending on the week, to try to really figure out what can they do to support our work to support the GCF, to support the overall finance plan. So I just want to say, I think it's a collaborative intragovernment effort to really tell the story.
Megan, may I add something to what Michelle just said? Thank you, Michelle, for bringing up the collaboration with USAID and GCF. I just wanted to cite an example, something very concrete that we've done in Micronesia in the Pacific Islands, a small island. We're working with a small NGO, regional NGO called the Micronesia Conservation Trust. USAID has been instrumental in building their capacity up to be able to access funding such as the GCF's funding and other climate finance funding. As you know, Micronesian islands, these are under tremendous threat from the climate hazards. They're already seeing the intrusion of water disturbing them. And the most vulnerable people who are being affected there are women and youth and smallholder farmers who don't have food security. They face these frequent hazards. USAID on the development side has done a lot of work with them, but they also help them prepare their documentation and others to be able to access GCF funding. And that was instrumental in getting that funding to them in a very short period of time since MCT engaged with the GCF. And so such collaboration, I think, in future will enable greater number of smaller organizations and NGOs and others to access GCF fund and actually get it to those people who actually need it much faster. So just wanted to give a shout out to that work of collaboration already.
I can see that there's already a good basis there for ramping up the efforts, joint efforts between USAID and Green Climate Fund. So good luck with that. In terms of the remaining questions that we have, they're quite specific for GCF on Africa and Middle East and North Africa. So I think maybe it might help to keep the conversation a little bit more general because we don't have a lot of time left. And another question was around food systems and turning them from GHG sources, greenhouse gas emission sources, to sinks. But again, that's quite specific. And I think Jennifer spoke a little bit about more action needed on that front. So I think as we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to actually ask a forward-looking question that's relevant to the diplomatic and political agenda that we have leading up to the COP26 climate change conference in November. And that is that obviously the GCF is not operating in a vacuum. It is a key part of the Paris Agreement architecture in terms of channeling a large proportion of the climate finance that was promised by richer countries under the Paris Accord. And I think it's very fair to say that this has actually been one rather disappointing area of action so far, in that, you know, we hear very much this appeal for donor nations to come up with the 100 billion a year that they promised from 2020 for developing and vulnerable countries. And that has yet to be fulfilled, even as talks are due to get underway on a new annual target, which should kick in from or after 2025. So as we wind up the discussion, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, what do you see as a minimum in terms of what needs to happen on climate finance to make COP26 a success? And, you know, how can your organization contribute to achieving that success on climate finance? So if it's okay, we'll start with Leo and then go to Kavita and then Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. I think it's worth first underlining that President Biden was very clear at the summit that achieving the $100 billion per year goal remains a priority for the United States and I would say for many other countries in the developed group. Second, I think it's really encouraging to see that the overall trajectory of climate finance since about 2013 has been on an upward steady slope. And remember, it's not just about hitting 100 billion. You have to continue to mobilize 100 billion every year systematically. And so we are increasingly getting there. The last numbers for which we have good data is 2018, at which point we were at almost 80 billion. And so we are within striking distance of the 100 billion, but an additional sustained effort is necessary. And that's why the president announced his pledge to double US climate finance. That's why we're working with other important countries and economies to also increase their finance. That's why we're working with the multilateral development banks, which have a hugely important role to play in this space, as well as with the GCF, which has obviously a key ability to help mobilize and catalyze some of that private finance in ways that help climate action. So it's clear that more has to be done. It's clear that the pandemic has deviated or pushed some money out of climate into other very understandable priorities. But now we need to figure out how to then have a very credible plan to get to the 100 billion as soon as possible.
Thanks, Leo. And Kavita, what's the GCF's view on this? And also in terms of the prognosis for being able to expand programming to the extent that GCF would like to be able to do? I mean, obviously it will be needing more funding from donors in future to do that.
Thank you, Megan, for the question. You're right. GCF current capacity, we're already programming $1 billion per board. We did that in November in our last board. In March of this year, we programmed $1.2 billion, which was our largest board approval. So we are ready to be programming at the level of $1.2 to $1.5 billion and can ramp up our capacity pretty rapidly. We're putting in a lot of efficiency measures. We're also looking at ways of increasing our regional presence to be able to work faster with the governments to bring, and the partners on the ground to bring that. We're improving our ability to do the accreditation models with lots more partners. We already have about 200 partners with whom we are working in the field. These partners are, apart from the multilateral development bank, these also include national development banks, the private sector, international and local, domestic, regional NGOs as well. So we stand ready to be able to mobilize. We work in a partnership format and we're able to scale up rapidly. So far, our $8 billion have mobilized, and in addition, about $22 billion. So currently, for the next board, we have more projects ready to go to the board than we have the commitment authority. So we're really looking forward to the support of the US government here to be able to mobilize that additional funding so that we can do what's needed to be done in scaling up finance rapidly.
Thanks, Kavita. And Michelle, what are your thoughts on this? It's quite a major challenge to get spending on climate change issues to the level that it needs to be from a development perspective. And so how important do you see this challenge of raising the finance within the scope of the UN climate talks to your own work?
So I just want to say thank you to the Wilson Center for having all of us. It was really nice to meet everybody. And it was Kavita and I got the memo this morning to wear our orange jackets. So we're colorful today. But I really think, this is a true challenge of our time. And I think the Biden-Harris administration has really demonstrated that through its commitments already. We at USAID, under Administrator Power's leadership, are seeing this as one of our top 2 or 3 priorities, and we will be working not only in the interagency with our partners, with the Green Climate Fund, but also with the private sector to support the efforts of former Secretary Kerry, Special Envoy, who is speaking to lots of private sector partners about the way forward. We'll also be working with the philanthropy sector, both the smaller philanthropies and the large ones, to say what is the way forward, and then finally working with our NGO community implementing partners to really think about, like TNC has done, what are some interesting models and new ways of thinking. I do think that there are a lot of people who want to see this as our chance to really step over the line and really be part of the effort. And so we are very pleased to be here, pleased to be part of the effort. And I think leading up to COP26, there will be more efforts you'll see to try to bring new and different partners to the table. So just thank you to everybody for everything you've done.
Thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers today, the keynote speakers, and also our excellent guests on the panel. I think for me, being outside the Washington space, it was very interesting to hear how much willingness and desire there is to ramp up the collaboration between the GCF and the US government, which is something that John Kerry signaled quite strongly when he appeared at a recent event. And I guess it's up to the people here in this discussion to really kind of make that happen and put it into practice. And also to hear about how many opportunities there are, in fact, to go into new areas of work and really scale that up, but equally that there are some quite huge challenges in terms of the pandemic, what that is doing to putting the pressure on governments and perhaps forcing them to choose in some cases between priorities to do with health and the pandemic and climate action priorities. So I think that makes it clear that more than ever, international collaboration partnerships are needed in order to be able to tackle those challenges at once, because climate action can't wait. And yes, looking forward to following this discussion in the follow-up to COP26 and beyond. So I'll close there for today and just say a thank you to all of the panelists for such a rich and thoughtful discussion. And in terms of housekeeping, the recording of today's event will be available on the Wilson Centre event page in the next day or so. And also there will be a summary of today's event on the Wilson Centre blog called New Security Beat in the coming weeks. So thanks everybody for tuning in and providing us with your insights today. Thank you very much and goodbye for now.